All right, well, welcome everybody to this social distancing edition of the Q-Farm seminar. We're delighted to have Mark Wilde as our speaker. He is an assistant professor or associate professor now, right? Congratulations.
Yeah.
Of physics at Louisiana State University and was formerly a postdoc with me at McGill University. He is currently spending the entire sabbatical year at Stanford, which is not exactly the experience that he had been hoping for, perhaps owing to the coronavirus, but he is still very much engaged in the intellectual life of the university, as evidenced by his speaking here today. He is really one of the most influential and prolific authors in the theory of quantum communication, also the author of an excellent and widely used textbook on the topic. And he's going to tell us about the generalized amplitude damping channel, single greatest qubit mystery in quantum Shannon theory. Just before we get started, if anybody has questions, then they should just type the questions into the chat dialog, and at an appropriate breaking point, I will ask the questions on behalf of the audience. And once the talk is open, then we'll open it up for more questions. All right, Mark, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Patrick, for the nice introduction. Yes, it's been nice to be here on sabbatical. I might be on lockdown for the entire sabbatical, which I guess will force me to sit down and think for long hours about research. I hope everybody's doing okay in this global pandemic. So yeah, what I'm going to tell you about today is some work that I did with Sumit and Kunal, who are students at LSU. This is work we did, I guess, roughly a year ago. We put it in the archive. It's still in review. And what I liked about it for this seminar is that it gives you a nice overview of the landscape of quantum Shannon theory, a lot of different techniques that have appeared over the past decade on a key physically well-motivated example, which is this generalized amplitude damping channel. And so I'll get a bit more into why I use this term greatest qubit mystery. Okay, so I thought it'd be nice to show you some pictures that I've taken while I've been around here. This was a picture. I've been hiking with my wife at the Stanford Dish hiking trail. I really like it a lot. And after the lockdown came into effect, I went hiking and saw some animals that usually don't come out. So that was very interesting. There were these deer that came out up close, not practicing social distancing. So the trail was shut down eventually. On the same day, I saw a coyote on the trail. That was actually pretty scary to see that big mouth of the coyote. And after this got shut down, we went and found that hiking near the Googleplex is still open. This is an image from the other day at sunset. Really beautiful around there. Hopefully they won't shut that one down. Okay, so let's get into it. Quantum Shannon theory, what are we trying to do? The main goal is to understand limitations of communication, and we're looking at quantum channels. At their core, every single communication channel is described by the laws of quantum mechanics to the best of our knowledge. And once you start considering things under a quantum lens, you can consider a variety of tasks beyond just sending ordinary classical bits. So the first task that was considered by Halevo and others for a long time was just sending classical bits. So that's classical communication. Then you can also consider sending classical bits that are protected and kept private from someone who's trying to eavesdrop on the channel. And that's related to quantum key distribution. So there are some nice links that can be made between quantum Shannon theory and quantum key distribution through the task of private communication. And then also motivated by quantum computing and the processing of qubits, you can consider communicating quantum information. So that's what we call quantum communication. And then, because nowadays classical communication is rather cheap, you can supplement a communication channel with classical communication, and then you get this task that we call LOCC-assisted. That's for local operations and classical communication. And that can be relevant for distributed quantum computing, the types of communication capacity bounds that you find in that context. And then finally, we have local operations and public communication assisting private communication. So that's a model where you have three parties. You have a sender, receiver, and eavesdropper. And the eavesdropper gets access to all the classical communication that Alice, the sender and receiver, communicate to themselves, to each other. But their goal is to distill like a secret key or to send bits privately in this process. Okay, and there's been a lot of progress on these topics. I would say classical communication was developed, understanding classical communication over quantum channels was developed primarily starting with the Halevo bound in 1973, and then some results in the early 90s motivated by the advent of quantum computing. And then private classical communication, the first major results there in the context of quantum Shannon theory were like mid 2000s, you know, and quantum communication was, let's say, late 90s to early 2000s. But then in the past decade, we've seen more progress on these assisted capacities. And so that's part of the talk as well. I have a lot of slides. I'm not going to be able to get through all of them in 1 hour. So what I'm going to be focusing on mostly is classical communication and quantum communication, and there probably won't be time to get to the LOCC stuff. So these slides are available online. I can put a link to that in the chat. I suppose at the end I could do that. Okay. So the goal of the talk is to summarize this progress on a very nice example that's physically motivated. That's this generalized amplitude damping channel. We've been studying it in the context of quantum Shannon theory and also in different contexts now with channel discrimination and even estimation theory. Okay, so, you know, there's this, I put in this term, greatest mystery to try to catch your eye. And now let me try to justify that. So a commonly considered class of qubit channels is the Pauli channel. So a Pauli channel applies, like you input a qubit into the channel and then randomly one of the four Pauli operators will get applied to it with some probability. And so this model has been studied a lot in the context of quantum computing, quantum error correction, and quantum communication. So their quantum capacity has been unknown for a long time. That's been a mystery. There's been recent progress from Felix Leditsky, Graham Smith, and others, and even more recent beyond the references I've given here. For these channels, the classical capacity is known, so that part is not a mystery. That was figured out by Chris King some time ago. And then when you look to classical, when you look in other directions, there's the amplitude damping channel is a popular model for quantum noise on qubits to be considered because it models like a relaxation process that occurs in many physical systems. So for that channel, its classical capacity has been unknown for a while. And people have been trying to establish bounds on classical capacity. Some recent progress from Xin Wang and his colleagues is listed here. But for this channel, the quantum capacity is known. So that's been known for a while, since 2005. And so when you interpolate between these two, you get this generalized amplitude damping channel. And for this channel, none of the capacities are known. So we don't know the classical capacity or the quantum capacity or the private capacity or the LOCC-assisted ones. And so that's why I'm saying it's the single greatest qubit mystery, because it's physically well motivated and because we don't know these capacities. So if you're coming up with some new technique for bounding capacity, which has been a topic of interest for a while now in quantum Shannon theory, you should test it out on this example, to see how it compares to what's out there. Now, there's this question about second greatest qubit mystery. The truth is, if you were to pick a channel at random, then I think it would have these properties where you would not know the classical capacity or quantum capacity. However, maybe that would be less well motivated physically. Okay, so let's define the GADC, generalized amplitude damping channel. It has two parameters that describe loss and noise. So, those are numbers between 0 and 1, describing the fraction of the state that kind of makes it through, and then the fraction of noise that gets added to the state. Okay, so if you're familiar with quantum information, then you know about how quantum channels can be represented in terms of Krauss operators. The GADC has 4 Krauss operators, which means that it's kind of like full rank, okay? And these are the Krauss operators. By staring at this, it doesn't really tell you that much, but that's how they're specified, so I just wrote them down. I'll try to give you a bit more intuition behind this channel in the next slide. Yeah, so gamma is loss and n is noise. I think it's helpful to think of the GADC with this kind of physical model in terms of a beam splitter and a thermal state in the background. So a qubit thermal state is just a mixture of 0 and 1. So n is the fraction of excited state that you have in this qubit thermal state. And then kind of the probability that an excitation would make it through from the input to the output is this 1 minus gamma, which is the flip of the loss parameter. And this is the probability that that excitation would go to the environment. So that's the model. It captures both thermal noise and damping or loss, a damping process. So that's why I like it. And there's a way you can, when you write down the math for this, you really see it precisely that it is this kind of analog. It's a qubit analog of a bosonic thermal channel. So if you studied Gaussian quantum information theory, you probably ran into the thermal bosonic channel. In that case, this indeed would be a beam splitter with a full description on an infinite dimensional Hilbert space. This would be a full thermal state of the bosonic field. But if you kind of constrain things to just the vacuum and a single excitation, you strip it down to this qubit setting and you get the generalized amplitude damping channel. Okay. So I want to give you a preview of the different results that we have to start out, just to show you, kind of give you a sense of how messy the situation is. The paper is about the progress that we made, but still I would say that the situation is pretty messy. So what we're doing is we're showing plots of the vertical axis is the classical capacity. So the units of this are classical bits per channel use, okay? And the classical capacity is defined roughly as, it's an asymptotic concept. How many bits can you transmit error-free per channel use if you're allowed many uses of the channel, and arbitrary quantum strategies to encode and decode those bits. Okay, so in each plot, the shaded region is kind of where we've pinned down the capacity. That's to lie somewhere in here. We don't know exactly where that is. The blue line is what is achievable. So that is what you can achieve by using a general kind of quantum strategy, invoking the results of Halevo, Schumacher, and Westmoreland from the early 90s. And then what we're looking at here are these various upper bounds that have appeared. So I'm not going to say too much what these are now, but they're various upper bounds that we get. So when the noise is low, you're actually close to the amplitude damping channel. So this 0.1, you're closer to the amplitude damping channel, for which we said we still don't know the classical capacity. Okay. So then you start increasing the noise in the background, and then we start, the region where we know the capacity lies starts shrinking, okay? And then we even see the different techniques come into play, so we have this entanglement breaking technique, so when does the channel become entanglement breaking, such that if you send an entangled state, it doesn't survive the action of the channel. So that's this purple dotted line starts coming into play. And we use this notion of approximate entanglement breaking. Okay, so at this point down here, it's becoming exactly entanglement breaking. And then for these other points, it's becoming approximately entanglement breaking. And then that idea is relevant. Another bound is it's a simple idea, what you get from entanglement assisted capacity. So if you supplement the sender and receiver of the channel with shared entanglement, and as much as they want, they can achieve a certain rate of communication. And for that task, we have a very nice formula that describes the capacity, and that's given by a quantum mutual information of the channel. And so that bound actually comes into play, and it plays a significant role for many noise regimes of interest. So we're increasing the noise, and then now there's this other technique that comes into play that we call approximately covariance. So the channel starts having more symmetry than its initial symmetry. And it has that symmetry approximately. So that comes into play and starts shaving down this top part when the loss is low. Okay, and then eventually, when n equals 0.5, the channel has, in some sense, full symmetry. It's fully covariant with all Pauli operators. And as a consequence of that, it becomes a Pauli channel. And when n equals 0.5, it's this full symmetry, it's a Pauli channel, and then we know the capacity exactly. Okay? So that's kind of the message that we have for classical capacity of GADC, and then you see 5 different techniques coming into play for the upper bound. Okay, and then later on I'll get into what some of these techniques are. I guess I was discussing it a little bit in the previous slide. Now I'm giving you some words that you can look at. So the first technique is when the channel becomes approximately entanglement breaking. The reason that's relevant is that when a channel is exactly entanglement breaking, we know its classical capacity. That's a result due to Peter Shore in 2004. And so you can think about, you can conceive a notion of a channel being approximately entanglement breaking. There's a way you can measure that. And then using that concept, you can get an upper bound. Similarly, for qubit covariant channels, we know their classical capacity. And so you can devise a notion of approximately covariant, and that technique came into play. We talked about entanglement assisted capacity. Then more recently, there were these ideas of using kind of an upper bound inspired by semi-definite programming. It can be calculated by a semi-definite program, so it can be calculated efficiently. And what you do is you impose constraints on the task. So you allow for correlations that are non-signaling, so that includes entanglement. But then you also demand another semi-definite constraint that the communication be positive partial transpose limited. So that kind of means that the resource that you're allowing them to share is not really that quantum, or the entanglement that they're sharing is kind of weakly entangled. So you impose these two constraints, which are semi-definite constraints, and then you can come up with an upper bound. And that's what these authors did in 2018. One thing that we did is, using their techniques, we found an analytic expression for the generalized amplitude damping channel. So indeed, you could, that's this red line here, the semi-definite programming bounds. Indeed, you could calculate that numerically, but we worked a bit using a combination of Mathematica and MATLAB, and we figured out an analytical expression. Okay, and then there's another technique by Sergei Filippov that I won't discuss much further. Okay, this is the story for quantum capacity. I guess in comparison to the previous plots we were looking at, the regions are a bit narrower, which is good. And we have all these various techniques that we're using, so the plot might look a bit messier, but the region to focus on is the shaded region. So here we have, 8 different kinds of bounds for the quantum capacity. First, I'll mention the lower bound. This is what's called the coherent information lower bound. That's due to work by Seth Lloyd, Peter Shore, and Igor Devitak. And that establishes a formula that you can calculate and optimize in order to figure out what is an achievable rate for quantum communication. So in the task of quantum communication, now you're trying to send qubits faithfully. So what we demand, it's again an asymptotic concept. What is the rate? What is the highest rate of qubits per channel use that you can send roughly error-free when you have many channel uses available, and a general quantum encoder and decoder. And so there are strong links between this theory of quantum capacity and the theory of quantum error correction. The theory of quantum capacity imposes like ultimate limits on quantum error correction codes. Okay, so using a good quantum error correcting code for these different noise regimes, you can achieve the solid black line. Okay, so that gives you a lower bound. And then what we're doing in this work is turning our efforts to figuring out upper bounds. And a variety of techniques we use for that, one of which is channel decomposition. So we can decompose a generalized amplitude damping channel as a serial concatenation of 2 different kinds of amplitude damping channels. And then because we know the quantum capacity of the amplitude damping channel, we can use those bounds to establish bounds on the quantum capacity of the generalized amplitude damping channel, because the capacity of a serial concatenation of 2 channels will be limited by the individual capacities, the capacities of the individual channels in the decomposition. And it's just it's often called like a bottleneck argument or a data processing argument. So it's kind of a simple concept. These other bounds, I guess, now I'm forgetting what each one is. I think this gold is a notion called approximately degradable. I'll get into that later, what that is. And then there's another bound, I believe it's the Q8. It's called Rains bound. So you use a measure like relative entropy to compare the output of the channel to the to a state that is weakly entangled. These kind of, I was talking in the previous slide about PPT entangled states. So what you do is you compare the output of the channel to a weakly entangled state. And then that concept gives you an upper bound, which comes into greater effect as the noise increases. Okay, so those are the different techniques. And, you see that there's still room for improvement. I should state that after our work came out, there was a paper in September of 2019 by Kun Fang and Hamza Fawzi, the brother of Omar Fawzi, who was there with Patrick and me at McGill some years ago now. They figured out some ways to improve these upper bounds. Unfortunately, I have not included those results here because I was just here. I'm presenting the results that we found. Okay, and in this case, what we're finding is that as the noise decreases, the region is shrinking. Why is that? Well, when there's no noise, you have the amplitude damping channel for which the quantum capacity is known. So it's kind of a different trend going on. Okay, and yes, I was talking about some of these techniques or some of these ideas behind the bounds. The way we get these bounds is by appealing to what's known for the amplitude damping channel, using this notion of approximate degradability. So these channels that are called degradable, we know their quantum capacity. For example, the amplitude damping channel itself is degradable. Later on, if there's time, I'll talk about this notion of approximately degradable. And then this range bound that I was talking about earlier. This bound started out in the theory of entanglement of bipartite states, and then in a work with Marco Tomaschel and Andreas Winter, we extended that concept to quantum channels and found a strong converse upper bound. I won't talk about what a strong converse is. It's just a sharper notion of converse than the usual converse of interest in quantum Shannon theory. Okay, and then now I want to summarize these results for the LOCC-assisted quantum capacity. So remember here, we're supplementing the use of the quantum channel with classical communication. So what that means is it's more like a dynamic process. It's kind of an adaptive feedback assisted process. So what the sender and receiver first do is that they can use the classical communication to prepare a separable state. Then the sender sends a quantum system through the channel, and then they can do, after that first use, they can do arbitrary local operations classical communication processing of the shared state that they have. Then they can use the channel again, they can do the LOCC, et cetera. So it's this back and forth interleads process. And you need different techniques to analyze such a capacity. You need quantities, you need information quantities that can control this kind of process. And so we do have such quantities, one of which is the squashed entanglement. So that's playing a role in these various upper bounds. And then this one on the top is another semi-definite programming bound. So, okay, so what's going on here? The lower bound, you could use the coherent information that we talked about on the previous slide. Coherent information it's an information quantity that has a direction from the sender to the receiver. There's another quantity that has come along, and it goes by the name reverse coherent information. It's a coherent information formula that has a direction from Bob to Alice. And so what that means is, what it means physically is the protocol would consist of the sender using the channel many times to share a quantum state between her and the receiver. And then the receiver can do some collective measurement and send classical information back to the sender. And then from that, they distill maximally entangled states. And the rate at which you can do that is this reverse coherent information. So that's what we're plotting in these lower bounds. Why are we plotting that? Well, this can get a higher rate. This strategy of, it's also in the context of quantum key distribution called reverse reconciliation. So for the generalized amplitude damping channel, that can get you a higher rate of quantum communication if you adopt such a strategy. So that's what we show in the lower bounds. And the upper bounds are based on this concept called squash entanglement. That itself is based on conditional mutual information. And for conditional mutual information, you have the chain rule, which is a very powerful tool to employ. And that is very helpful for analyzing these feedback-assisted protocols and getting control on them. And so that's what we're using for these upper bounds. And I think at the same time, the decomposition of a GADC into two different amplitude damping channels. And then, okay. So what we see is that the region is becoming more known as the noise increases. So the region where we think the capacity lies is becoming smaller, and so we're kind of knowing more about the capacity as the noise gets larger. Okay, so I mentioned some of the techniques: squash entanglement, upper bound. Squash entanglement is an entanglement measure that's very useful for this kind of thing of getting upper bound. There's another. So previously for the unassisted quantum capacity, I talked about the range information upper bounds. If you, instead of using quantum relative entropy, you use a quantity that's larger than that, it's called max relative entropy, then you get this max range information bound. And the key thing about the max relative entropy is that it obeys a triangle inequality. And that's very powerful for analyzing these feedback assisted protocols, having a triangle inequality. The reason we can't use relative entropy itself is that in general, it does not obey a triangle inequality. Okay, and then there is another technique called teleportation simulation of a channel. That's a powerful technique for understanding feedback assisted capacities. What it's saying is that with this teleportation simulation technique, you can send in a maximally entangled state and kind of take full control of the channel. What do I mean by that? If you send in the maximally entangled state to the channel, you get some noisy state that represents the channel. That's often called choice state. And then by subsequently doing LOCC processing of that choice state and an input, you can simulate the channel. And so that idea has been around for a long time. Actually, in 1996, there's this famous paper on entanglement theory by Bennett, DiVincenzo, Smolin, and Wooters. And that concept was first put forward there. And so by making a notion of approximate teleportation simulation, we get another upper bound. That concludes the first section. I don't know if there are any questions at this point. That was kind of a lot of information. We've hit 12:35, so, you know.
If anyone has any questions, they can just write them into the chat box, and I'll forward them to Mark.
By forward, you mean you'll just...
Well, I will repeat them.
Okay.
I will read them.
All right. Okay, so that's the first part of the talk. And judging by the time, I think I'll only be able to get through the classical communication. So if people are interested, I suppose we could organize some kind of grassroots extension of the talk. I gave this talk in Sweden in May of 2019, and it turned into a 2-hour talk. And so for the first hour, people attended, and then for the second hour, we agreed that whoever was not interested was not required to attend. And anyway, so let's proceed. Okay, classical communication. What is that in more detail? Sender and receiver we call Alice and Bob, and they're connected by a quantum channel. They're allowed to use it n times, where n is typically some large number. This is how you define a code. The main thing here is that you're trying to use
Mark,
the channel.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Since we actually have our first question, just to encourage questions. So Eric Cooper asks, are there promising methods for pushing up the lower bounds in addition to the methods you mentioned for lowering the lower bounds, or lowering the upper bounds?
That's right. So that's a very good question. That has been considered. We did not consider that here. So let's go to quantum communication. We talked about the coherent information lower bound. So what we're doing is we're evaluating this entropy formula with respect to a single copy of the channel, okay? And what that means is that there's a code that corresponds to that state that you make from the channel, okay? Nothing prevents you from taking 2 copies of the channel, sending in a more general state, and then evaluating the coherent information formula. But to get the rate in the right units, you need to divide by 2. And so that can only do better. You can keep doing that for any integer k. You can take k copies of the channel, evaluate coherent information, divide by k. And then you can get potentially higher rates by doing that. And so that's a well-known technique that you could use. We didn't consider it here, but it's a good point. And maybe the referee should have suggested that. The referee did not suggest it. But we're just, here we're just trying to get a sense. We're trying to get mostly a sense of the upper bounds. That was the main focus of the work. And then similarly, you can do that for, okay. So one thing I should clarify is that when n equals 0, you have the amplitude damping channel. That does not help. This regularization process where you're taking more and more copies of the channel. So that doesn't help because the coherent information is the capacity. For the LOCC-assisted capacity, that's an even better question. There's more room to do work there. So here we were just evaluating the reverse coherent information with respect to a single copy of the channel. You could do so with respect to 2 copies of the channel as well. But now with the LOCC-assisted setting, you can kind of work with a state that you can make from LOCC and evaluate some kind of coherent information formula. And so that could get very complicated. And nevertheless, if you could probably, if I had to put down money, I would bet that you could push up the lower bounds. I don't know about how much, but you could probably push it up a fair amount by doing that. And so that would be interesting to see. Thanks for the question. Okay, so classical communication. Here you allow for, you're trying to send M messages, and you allow for an encoding, a classical to quantum channel. You're trying to encode classical correlations. So this bar means like dephased version of maximally entangled states, so just classical correlations. So you do the encoding, you center the channel, you do a decoding measurement, a quantum to classical channel. And then you use some measure to figure out like how well you did in this process. And that can be fidelity, for example. So we say an NM epsilon code obeys such a constraint. And the rate of communication will be the number of bits log of the number of messages divided by n number of channel uses. Okay. And if you want to picture, this is what the picture looks like. So you can think of it as like n parallel uses of the channel big N. You do some encoding that can consist of preparing entangled states. You do a decoding. In general, you want this to be what's called collective measurement of many of the channel outputs. And you try to decode the classical message. Let me go fast over this. This is just defining capacity. So you define what's meant by an achievable rate. It's basically that you want the error tending to 0 as n gets larger. And you want that to happen at essentially a fixed rate. And so the capacity is the largest achievable rate. What's known about the classical capacity? I was talking about the results of Halevo, Schumacher, and Westmoreland. We're going to call the classical capacity C of n. Halevo, Schumacher, and Westmoreland showed that this hybrid classical quantum mutual information is achievable. It's also called Halevo information, and it's given by this formula. So you optimize the mutual information. Mutual information is a linear combination of entropies, entropy of X, entropy of B, minus entropy of XB. So you optimize that formula with respect to all classical ensembles that you could prepare at the input. But the signaling states that you're using are quantum states. So they can be like non-orthogonal. If you have multiple channel uses, it can be entangled states, and you can see some benefits there. So you know that rate's achievable. We also know that for certain channels, there's a strict separation between the Halevo information and the capacity. Patrick did work on that back in 2007, 2008, and then Hastings, finished it off and showed the strict separation. Okay, so that's called superadditivity of classical communication. Okay, and in general, you can use this regularization technique that we were talking about to kind of climb up to the capacity. And you can prove that the capacity is given by this formula. This is just kind of a theoretical construct. You can't actually compute this. And if you're seeking open questions, a great open question is the classical capacity uncomputable? Some people have worked on that. That would be a very interesting question to make progress on. For certain channels, the Halevo information is additive. What does that mean? It means that you don't have to do this regularization, that chi n is equal to Cn. So that includes entanglement breaking channels, qubit unital channels. They have a lot of symmetry. Unital means that the channel preserves the identity matrix. No other classes, but we're going to focus on these two. So entanglement breaking, if you apply the channel to a bipartite state and the identity to the other share, you get a separable state. If you want to figure out if a channel is entanglement breaking, the definition says you need to look at all input states, but it turns out you only need to look at one, and that's the maximally entangled state. An entanglement breaking channel, you can break down into a process where there's like a classical line in between. So the channel can be simulated by a process where you first measure, that's this M, you get classical data, and then you prepare the P. You prepare a quantum state based on the measurement results. And so this measurement, this in-between classical process is what's killing off the entanglement with the reference system that could be fed in that's somehow correlated with the input system. Okay, I guess the technical thing I'll get to is what is the notion of approximately entanglement breaking? How do we measure, how do we do that? So we need a metric on channels. The common one to consider is diamond norm. This was proposed by Kataev in 1997. This is where you maximize overall inputs to the channel, but you include entangled states that you can input. And you measure the distinguishability with the trace norm, which is a standard metric for quantum states. This looks like a lot. The diamond norm can be calculated by a semi-definite program. So why is that useful? Well, if you want to calculate things, it's helpful to have a way to do so. And the point is that you can program this into MATLAB using this CVX package written by people at Stanford, Stephen Boyd and his students. So the point is that you can plug this code, this pseudocode into MATLAB and then calculate this for any two channels, as long as you have what's called the choice state of the channel, which is proportional to when you send it the maximally entangled input state. Okay, so I don't want to say too much more about that. But it's very interesting to study these semi-definite programs and their duals and calculate them. The operational meaning of the diamond norm is that it's a distinguishability scenario. So you imagine a guessing game where Alice prepares an input state, sends one share of it to Bob, who applies the channel N or M randomly with probability half. And then the output gets sent back to Alice. And then her goal is to figure out which channel was prepared, N or M. And the success probability is this. It's the bias away from random guessing. So the diamond distance of the channels has the interpretation as the bias away from random guessing. So that's why it has a meaning as a distinguishability measure. So approximate entanglement breaking, how do we define this concept? So let's just say that this is the set of entanglement breaking channels. All channels such that when you act on a maximum entangled state, you get a separable state. So a channel is approximate entanglement breaking if it's epsilon close to some entanglement breaking channel in the diamond distance. Okay. And that gives us an upper bound. So can't really get into the technique for how you show this, but the main concept is that if a channel is approximately entanglement breaking, then you can upper bound it by the Halevo information, which is something you can calculate for the nearest entanglement breaking channel, plus some correction terms, which correspond to the error for which it's entanglement breaking. This quantity for qubit channels you can compute. So this, the epsilon, which is the minimum epsilon for the entanglement breaking, for approximate entanglement breaking, we call that the entanglement breaking parameter. That you can compute using a semi-definite program for qubit channels. But once you start going beyond qubit channels, you'll have difficulty. And this semi-definite program is a combination of the one for diamond norm plus some constraints that correspond to the channel being entanglement breaking. Okay, and then, you know, for the GADC, you have some region for which it's entanglement breaking. So it's only a small region. So remember, with the generalized amplitude damping channel, you have the noise parameter, you have the loss parameter. And so for this portion, you have the, that it is entanglement breaking. And so we were seeing that on the edge of the plots. I'll go back real quick to that. So on the very edge of the plots, sorry, I don't have a quicker way. See this purple, that's where the channel is becoming entanglement breaking, where this purple is meeting the lower bounds. Okay, and then once we start going away from that, it's approximate entanglement breaking. So it's a pretty good bound for high loss, but then for, you know, it ends up not being so great for lower loss. Okay, let me just flip real quick. Ah, that's a shame. I had the plots right here. Okay. Good. Okay. I think we'll talk about one more technique, and then we'll unfortunately we'll then end the talk, and we'll go into questions. So I just want to talk about this next technique of approximately covariant. Okay. So we say that a channel is covariant with respect to these unitary representations of a group if it's kind of like these unitaries commute with the channel. So if you do U of G at the input, it's the same as doing V of G at the output. And that's a symmetry that can be useful in a variety of contexts to study. A group forms a one design if when you average the state over the elements of the group, you get the maximum mixed state. So, you know, that's a bit more symmetry than this kind of generic notion of covariance. What is the relevance? The results of Chris King is that for a qubit channel, if you're covariant with respect to a one design on the output, then the classical capacity is given by the Halevo information quantity. So that's a very nice result. And then the GADC, it already has some symmetries. So it's covariant with respect to sigma z. So if you do Pauli sigma z on the input, you get Pauli sigma z on the output. So that's very nice. If you do Pauli sigma x and Pauli sigma x in the output, sorry, sigma x in the input and at the output at the same time, you flip the noise parameter from n to 1 minus n. So, you know, it's a kind of symmetry, but it doesn't get you back to the original channel unless you do it again. Okay, so it has these symmetries, and then what this implies is that if n is, you know, if this parameter here is equal to this one, and that happens at n equals a half, then it has the full symmetries of the Pauli group. So it's covariant with respect to identity, sigma x, sigma z, sigma y. And then it gives you the hint that as you go away from 1/2, it's going to be kind of approximately covariant. So that's what we used here. So we say that a channel, you can take any channel and twirl it. This concept gets used a lot in quantum error correction, and I think even randomized benchmarking. So you're trying to benchmark quantum computers. So this technique of twirling is kind of wide interest. And what you're doing is you're effectively symmetrizing the channel. It gets used in QKD also to reduce the number of parameters that characterize the channel. So what you're doing here is you pick a random group element, apply the corresponding input unitary, apply the inverse of the output unitary, and then you've symmetrized the channel. And that's called twirled channel. This can also be realized by teleportation over the Choi state of the channel. So approximate covariance, what we're doing is we're just comparing the channel to its twirled version. That's the notion that we put forward. And we say that a channel is approximately, you know, epsilon covariant if the diamond distance between the channel and its twirled version is less than epsilon. So using that, we get a bound for all qubit channels. And then for the GADC, we can compute the bound analytically. So that was, we figured out how to compute this diamond distance analytically. And so then you really see it here in this correction term, right? If n is close to a half, then the bound will be good. As it starts getting away, it's not going to be good. As it starts getting away from a half, it's not going to be good. So that is the green line. So that, you know, when you're far from a half with, when the noise is far from a half, the green line is not even in contention as a good bound. But then it starts for low loss becoming a contender, you know. And then at noise equal to a half, it exactly coincides with the lower bounds. Okay. We hit 12:55. I think I should simply stop now.
All right. Well, thank you very much,
Actually,
Mark.
maybe I should have some kind of conclusion.
Do you want to
Yeah, let me
conclude
flip
for
it.
us? Okay.
I have some concluding slides. Okay, a lot of concepts here. Okay, one thing that we did that I only learned this, that you could do this like maybe 2 years ago, and we started doing it very regularly. With the archive, you can share ancillary files. Okay, so if you develop code with your papers, it can be very helpful for other people trying to extend your results to have access to these codes. And so we put up all of our code. You see 211 additional files not shown. And so, we noticed that when the Kun Fang Hamza Fawzi paper came out, they had used a lot of this code. And it was, I think, helpful for them to make their plots. So that's something you can do. So in our results, we used a mixture of Mathematica, Python, and MATLAB. Basically, they're helpful for different reasons, and so we used all of them. Conclusion, yes, GADC is a great challenge in quantum Shannon theory. In this work, we used a variety of techniques to narrow down the capacities. To make more progress, you're going to need new techniques. After this work, a new technique did appear. So Fang and Fawzi, who I've mentioned a few times now, they used a distinguishability measure called geometric Renyi relative entropy that has very nice properties, including one that's called chain rule, which is analogous to chain rule for conditional mutual information. And they were able to get nice bounds for the feedback assisted capacities. And then, as I was saying earlier, if you're going to come up with a new technique, you should really test it out on this generalized amplitude damping channel. And I think that's all I have. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark. I don't know how to simultaneously unmute everyone at the same time, so I'm going to clap for you on behalf of everybody. So, and I'll open it up to questions now. Does anybody have anything that they would like to ask Mark about the talk or about quantum communication in general, because he really is truly one of the world's experts? I might kick it off. Just in the case of the classical capacity, it looked like all the upper bound curves that you drew were active in terms of cutting out the region at some point. But for the quantum capacity, you had a number of curves that didn't actually seem to play any role in shrinking the region.
Yes. So what's going on is we're showing, okay, so yes, you know, the shaded region depicts where things are known. And then the different colors depict the techniques and where they're active, right? So I believe we're only showing, okay, that's not true. Yeah, you're right. So the green doesn't seem to be relevant, and the purple is not relevant. But these concepts were similar to the concepts behind the red and the blue. So the red and the blue were from the data processing bottleneck technique, and then those become less relevant as the noise is increased. And I think, again, that has to do with proximity to the amplitude damping channel. You know, so, and then for the most part, I think this approximate degradable, this kind of oop de oop, is only relevant for low noise. And again, that has to do with proximity to degradable channels.
I see. So then I guess part of the message again is that if you have an upper bound technique, you should test it on this channel, and you may actually find that in no parameter regime does it
Right.
beat other known techniques.
Yeah, and then you'll struggle to publish, I guess.
Mark, I had a very general question. I was wondering if you could maybe provide a little more background on those assisted protocols. I wasn't familiar with them.
Okay, so I guess this was like the final section. I'll keep it brief. There's a picture that can depict it well, and it's this picture. So LOCC-assisted means between every channel use, you can have local operations in classical communication. So Alice and Bob can use local fault-tolerant quantum computers, make whatever quantum states they want, and then use classical communication to do some coordination. So here in this first step, they can only make a separable state. They can only make a separable unentangled state. Then using the channel, if the channel has some ability to generate entanglement, then at this point they can have an entangled state. And they keep doing this, and they use the channel n times. The goal at the end is to make a maximally entangled state. Why is that? Well, because the classical communication is free, you can then combine that maximum entanglement with teleportation to communicate any quantum state from Alice to Bob. So that's the idea there. And then basically, to summarize what kind of quantities are useful, if an information quantity has chain rule or triangle inequality, which are actually somewhat similar, then you can bound these capacities. And so squash entanglement, I don't know if I defined that anywhere. It's defined like this in terms of conditional mutual information, basically correlations between Alice and Bob conditioned on the system of an eavesdropper, subject to some optimization. That has a chain rule. It has lots of wonderful properties. And then this, I think I have this other quantity, max range. Yeah, this quantity where you're comparing using this max relative entropy of the channel output to a PPT state, essentially. This is very nice because it obeys triangle inequality. And so it allows you to, you know, kind of at each step of the protocol, bound the amount of entanglement you can make. And so what you're kind of doing with these quantities is you're saying, okay, you're just summing up the entanglement of each step. And so with any LOCC, you can't make any entanglement, so those go away, they're zero value. And then you're just evaluating the measure on each channel. So it'd be like little n times the entanglement of each channel use. And that's the basic concept behind getting a handle on these capacities. And this is the work that really has been done in the past, I don't know, 5-6 years.
Thanks.
There's another question from Eric Cooper. Eric, I'll just unmute you so you can ask your question, okay?
So I was interested in the quantum information case, that some of the upper bounds seem to increase with higher noise.
Yes.
And do you think there's a reason to believe that that's a real effect, that adding noise will increase the capacity of the channel?
Oh,
particularly for high attenuation, like 0.4.
It should not be increasing. I mean, like when you look at, so the actual value of the capacity should not be increasing, right? See, when the noise is small, we're over here, somewhere between 0.4 and 0.5. But then over here, I see. You're saying the upper, you're complaining about the upper bounds.
The upper bounds. Uh-huh.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it seems that you should be able to improve the upper bounds. I believe this is, well, did Fang and Fawzi have improvements here? I don't think Fang and Fawzi had improvements over this one because the geometric Renyi relative entropy is larger than the quantum relative entropy. So I don't think they improved over this range bound. And so, yeah, it's just, I think it's just a matter of lack of techniques. But you have the right idea. This should be getting smaller. So it's a problem with the upper bound, if I had to guess.
Okay, thanks.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Mark again on behalf of his many listeners far and wide, mostly in Stanford, but probably elsewhere as well. And I don't know.
Mark, let me share the link for this.
Oh yeah, right.
Just figure out where that was. Pull it up here. I can put it in the Zoom. Where did the Zoom chat go? Now I'm confused.
I think if you click Zoom, you may get the chat window in the foreground.
Here?
Oh, you're already in Zoom. I see. If you go to the bottom of the screen, you might get your Zoom control panel coming back up.
I see.
Do you?
I think I can just unshare the screen. Okay. And then now I can put it in the chat. Okay. Got it?
Yep, I can see it.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, and if anyone has questions, feel free to email, and you know we could potentially schedule another Zoom discussion.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you again, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to present. I hope to see everyone, well, at some point.
Yeah. Oh, you're getting some applause now. Some silent applause. I see them. All right. Well, enjoy your next hike.
Yeah, thanks.
I look forward to seeing some photographs and to seeing you in person in the not too distant future.
Okay.
All right. Bye, Mark. Thanks again.
All right. Bye-bye.